Hey guys, so here's part 3 of the 2.7 Extension Day 1 notes. We're now going to write linear equations for the lines given. Now notice the lines are going to be restricted. So just kind of like how we graphed it, we are actually doing the reverse. So they're going to give us the graph and we're going to write it just like we do with the mx plus b, but also using that restriction, okay? So remember, anytime we write a line, it's always going to be in the form of y equals mx plus b. Okay, let's look at the first one. Now notice we have a horizontal line. How do we ever write an equation for horizontal? Remember, that is always as y equals, and then whatever the y-intercept is. So notice here that our graph crosses the y-intercept of 3. So we're going to have y equals 3. But because we have a restriction, now we say when, and then when we write our restriction, it will always be using x. No matter what, it's always x. Now the next part is we need to determine, in this case we have an open circle, right? So we need to determine what is the x value of this open circle. Well, I go over, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So the x value of the open circle is 4. Now notice I left some room in between my x and 4. It's because I have to include an inequality. Now we need to look at this graph and see, when we look at this graph, are the x values getting smaller than 4 or bigger? Well, notice because it's going towards the left, the x values are getting smaller. So what type of inequality would we use? We would use a less than symbol. Now the last thing is we need to determine, are we going to have an equal bar? Well, notice that at the open circle, it is open. So that means we don't have an equal bar on our inequality. So our final answer here is going to be y equals 3 when x is less than 4. So that's how you guys are going to write your equations, because now you're going to have restrictions with them as well. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do the next problem. So once again, we are going to write it in the form of y equals mx plus b. And so what we need to do, notice it's not horizontal, it's diagonal. So we do need to determine the slope and the y-intercept. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and find 2 points on this graph. So we have this point here, and it looks like maybe this point, and determine what is the slope, okay? So it looks like I go up 1, 2, 3 to the right one. Now let me do that one more time just to make sure that I did this correctly. Well, here's another point on the graph, so it looks like I go up 1, 2, 3, over 1. So that means my slope here of 3, so up 3 to the right one, and I got to simplify that. Remember, always simplify your fraction. My slope is 3. Now, let's determine the y-intercept. Now, our graph does cross the y-intercept, so all I need to do is I need to count. So I go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my b value is 6. Now that I know my slope and my y-intercept, I'm going to write it in that y equals mx plus b form. So we have y equals 3x plus 6. Now we need to determine our restriction here. I'm going to kind of go ahead and erase my red so I can do this. Now remember, when we do this, we need to go from the starting point for our restriction. Well, what looks like the very first point that we would have plotted? It looks like it's going to be this point here, okay? So think about it, since we are doing array, it's going to be your starting point of the array. That's what's going to be part of the restriction. So we are going to have to use that point. We're going to determine what is the x value of that point. Well, it looks like it's -2. Now, whenever we do our restriction, we always use x, and our x value of that is -2. Now, our next thing is to determine, are the x values getting larger than -2 or smaller? Well, it looks like my graph is going to the right-hand side. So that means if I'm going to the right, my x values are getting larger. So that means I'm going to have a greater than, And is our point open or closed? It's closed. So that means we will have an equal bar. So our restriction is x is greater than or equal to -2. So our final answer here is going to be y equals 3x plus 6 when x is greater than or equal to -2. Okay, make sure you watch our last part of the video. It is just going to have more examples of how to write linear equations with restriction.